Here, thanks, Eli. Appreciate it. So, like Eli said, my name is Lane Moser. I'm a second-year graduate student at the University of Minnesota, advised by Marcella Windmuller-Campioni and Eli Sagor. I'll be graduating this May. My graduate work focuses on both a 20-year remeasurement of a soil compaction study in Aspen and determining how effective a case study library is at conveying information to managers. So today I'm going to be talking about the Great Lakes Silviculture Library. I'll open with some of the important themes from my research that I'll be going into during the talk. The primary use of the library was as a reference to prescriptions. It was part of a larger sweep of information and resources, but was often viewed when a forester was just exploring their options and getting inspiration for a site, when they're working with a less familiar forest type or certain methods, or when trying to address a forest health threat. The biggest barrier to its use was time. So this is what the next 15 or so minutes are going to look like. I'll give an overview of what the Silviculture Library is, very briefly go over my research question and methods, but then I'll just dive into how the Silviculture Library is used, some barriers to both its use and the submittal of case studies, and then go into the strengths and the weaknesses that came up, which will provide a deeper context to the use and the barriers. The Silviculture Library was developed in 2015 by the University of Minnesota and the Minnesota Forest Resources Partnership and is maintained by the University of Minnesota's Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative, SFEC. The library services the Great Lakes region consisting of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ontario, Canada. The overarching goal of the library is to provide an open source, easily usable platform for foresters to share silvicultural prescriptions and forest management treatments across organizations and state and county boundaries. Unlike replicated studies designed for peer-reviewed literature, entries to the Silviculture Library can best be described as case studies. Each individual entry represents a location or potentially a series of locations where a treatment was implemented and the subsequent outcomes are documented. Foresters drive the creation of content by contributing case studies themselves. Each case study is built on a template which can be downloaded from the website and ensures consistency in entries. The template includes, oh boy, there we go. The template includes sections to provide the full context for a treatment. Before publication on the library, the draft case study is reviewed by SFEC employees. This review allows for a level of quality control on the type of content, silvicultural terminology, and gives them the ability to refine a submission prior to publication on the library. Since 2015, 118 case studies have been published. Each case study is classified into one of 9 distinct cover types found in the Great Lakes region. The other cover type here refers to floodplain and other forest communities that are not well captured by the other categories. The goal of my research is simply to figure out if a case study library is an effective way of conveying information. To that end, I ended up conducting 6 focus groups, organizing potential participants into 2 strata by their role within their organization for 3 focus groups each. And these strata were field foresters or administrators. From the fall of 2019 through the summer of 2020, 35 foresters with federal, state, county, tribal, and industry backgrounds participate in the focus groups. The number of participants in the discussion ranged from 4 to 8, with an average of 5.8. Now I'll move on to my results shortly, but having methodically grouped participants, we actually didn't find many differences in how the library was used based on their roles between field and administrator. But there were some differences in use patterns across agencies and organizations, and I'll unpack those where they come up. Again, with these big picture ideas for my findings, the library is used as a reference, often not with any sort of regularity. It saw use when foresters were uncertain, especially in the context of forest health threats like eastern larch beetle, buckthorn, or deer browse. But using it was a luxury in some cases because how many different priorities a forester has. I'll now move through some representative quotes for the results section to really explore these concepts. One of the most frequent responses by foresters when asked how they use the library was broadly as a reference to prescriptions. This could take the form of looking up specific silvicultural systems or techniques to see how they were implemented. It could be looking for case studies in an unfamiliar forest type, one that you might not have a lot of on your own land, or it could be looking at how to deal with forest health threats. In these cases, it gave participants an idea of whether or not a treatment would work on their own land and what sort of results that they could expect. Case studies on the library could be used to justify a prescription, to potentially show a precedent for a certain management action. Scroll wheel. Another common response as part of this theme was seeing what the neighbors were up to, meaning that foresters could look at how adjacent agencies or organizations were managing their land. Participants mentioned using the silviculture library as a way to teach employees, both newer and more experienced, or private landowners, and to generally communicate concepts within and beyond agencies. Directing newer foresters to the library was seen as a way to foster their professional development, encouraging them to problem solve, while other participants used case studies to guide interns and provide structure for some of their seasonal work. Case studies were used in a field tour to demonstrate treatments, translating the description and figures on the library to what the site actually looked like on the ground. Another participant thought that case studies benefited the collective profession to ensure foresters focused on pure, practical silvicultural training and examples. On that same note, some participants viewed the library as a repository for silvicultural prescriptions, noting the value of documenting long-term results in the same place, not only for internal knowledge and reference, but also being able to show the public what certain management activities consist of in a clear format. Now, only participants with certain organizations felt that it was a priority to have the silviculture library as a place for their prescriptions to be documented long-term, but this was not correlated with the organization's size. Folks from both smaller and larger staffs commented on this, so it doesn't seem that it's an issue of people power, but rather whether it's a priority for management. And that management piece is a key part, so I'll circle back to that idea in a couple of slides. Case studies were perceived to bridge a gap between theory and practical application of silvicultural principles that benefited foresters by providing a structure to show how a management problem was addressed. While the structure is different from studies that have the end goal of producing peer-reviewed publications, case studies were viewed as a way to provide initial results or questions to guide future research by showing recurring themes or challenges that managers were facing. Of all the barriers to using the library or submitting case studies, time was by far the most common response. Whether it was taking the extra time to visit the library to get inspiration for a prescription, or carving out a block of time to compile information on a treatment and then plug it into the template, folks just have so many other things going on that often it isn't viable. In addition, if someone starts a case study and then switches jobs or moves or to a different office or retires, it can be difficult to have that follow through to pick up the extra work and push it across the finish line. This was primarily mentioned in the context of newer employees who may not only see the writing of a case study fall to them, but also may be more likely to relocate. Building off of this idea of not having enough time is the aspect of management support for spending work hours towards writing case studies. If putting a treatment into a case study is too time intensive as far as the data collection or the actual write-up is concerned, then as a manager, it's hard to justify pushing it up the list of priorities. Across both the field and the administrator focus groups, there was a feeling that if publishing case studies was a goal, then this push to publish needed to come from management because there was already just more than enough work priorities on a forester's desk. Regarding the actual content of a case study, novelty refers to a forester perceiving that what they're doing wasn't interesting enough to be made into a case study. That a soft requirement for submissions is that they're cutting edge silviculture in action, or that a seemingly mundane treatment is implemented, but a few years later you realize you're getting something completely different, and you may not be able to access that full documentation to translate those findings into a case study. In either case, this was a barrier to submitting. But in multiple focus groups, participants also thought that there was a value to showing a more standard operating procedure prescription, both to a newer forester who's just trying to learn the ropes and add to their silvicultural toolbox, and to foresters as a whole, to see how other agencies are managing their land. Someone else noted that writing up case studies with these standard prescriptions had a historical value for long-term record keeping to show how forest management is carried out now. So there's that longevity aspect in a different context, thinking about not just the next 4 years, but the next 40. Even if there is time set aside to begin a case study, and a forester has a really neat treatment they'd like to publish, another barrier that came up was related to issues with the actual creation of the case study. Familiarizing oneself with the website and the submission process was intimidating and potentially time-intensive, despite efforts to ensure that the information the case study template asked for was already on hand in some form or another. The perception that a case study involved more work than it actually required was also a barrier. This was mentioned both in the context of thinking purely about the work involved, but also the perception that several years of data were required, when in fact the template only prompts for those initial findings at minimum. When thinking about how daunting it could be to start a case study, however, participants that had written case studies of their own agree that the process became distinctly easier on subsequent submissions. So there's a slight learning curve. I'll now go into some key strengths and weaknesses of the platform that came up in the focus groups. In many cases, there were positive and negative aspects mentioned for a given theme. For example, the case study format was seen as occupying a sweet spot between an anecdote such as, I did this on this site and it worked, and a peer-reviewed study that you'd find in the Journal of Forestry. Folks felt that case studies provided enough information and context to replicate a treatment without being written in the length or the style of peer-reviewed literature and being easier to publish a finished write-up by comparison. However, some participants felt that case studies could be distilled further and that a new kind of content could be introduced that offered even more succinct insights into forest management. This content could consist of simple tips, techniques, and general information that might be relevant to a visitor on the site, but is not robust enough to justify a full case study. Another downside associated with the template was that it was difficult to document multiple entries into the same stand. To use an actual example on the library, Carleton County implemented a group selection harvest to regenerate northern hardwoods, and it's great. But if they come back to that stand and they use the Femmelschlag technique, like they mentioned, to expand those gaps, create that edge, and open up growing space, or they create entirely new gaps, it's not readily apparent where the author should put that information, and it bleeds into existing sections, making it harder for the reader to figure out what exactly happened at what point. And that's a big shortcoming of the template itself. One downside that came up was the relative lack of failed treatments. Now, I initially referred to them as failures, but one participant suggested calling these failed treatments surprises instead. I like that. I think it's a little more positive. But regardless of what they're called, the lack of treatments that didn't quite go as planned is seen as a shortcoming of the library. Folks generally agree that there is a lot of value to seeing treatments with surprising outcomes, but express concern about how those treatments would be perceived by others, namely the public. So there's a stated interest in seeing these surprise treatments to share the lessons learned the hard way, but also a reluctance to submitting them. It's just bad for morale. Lastly, the library was viewed as easy to browse, hard to search. The library is in kind of a limbo where there's a huge diversity of treatments, which was valuable, but may lack a variety of examples for a given cover type and silvicultural system. There were comments acknowledging that the library was a good concept, but actually implementing the treatments described in case studies was not viable for financial or other reasons. And this partly stems from the relative youth of the library, and that while there's over 100 case studies, given the combinations of silvicultural system and cover type alone, a forester might not be able to find something that they can replicate in their own stand.
Lane, you've got about 1:40.
Perfect. Thank you. So again, coming back to these key takeaways from my work, plus a few extra bonus ones. Folks typically view the library on an as-needed basis, rather than regularly checking it. Most often, it was used as a reference to prescriptions, but there was also that feeling of longevity associated with it, to document actions long-term and capture that experiential knowledge of foresters, particularly before they retire. The biggest barrier to its use was time. There's just so much on a forester's plate, so using it as a reference or submitting a case study is a luxury in some instances. And tied in with that is the perception that creating case studies is just a daunting process. Management support. If this is a priority, it can be really beneficial to integrate this into existing workloads so that folks feel supported in taking the time to contribute case studies. Key strengths were the format, providing enough information to give context to a treatment while not getting drawn out into a 12-page document, and the diversity of treatments. Conversely, there was concern about a lack of failed treatments, which can be hugely valuable and just be a real cost saver for foresters. I'd like to thank my focus group participants for being part of a really rich discussion and being patient through COVID-related rescheduling. I truly, truly appreciate it. I'd also like to thank my advisors, Marcella and Eli, and the funding sources for my graduate work. Thank you.